that is something that needs to be discussed and why that's something that's important. The other issue that we'll talk about today also is called illat riba. Like, what is the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited riba? And what's interesting about this is that you actually have a statement from Umar radiallahu anh. He said that when the revelation came down, the one thing that I wish the Prophet ﷺ had actually explained more was riba. Like, he actually spent time, and he spent a little bit more time discussing what riba is, because there's an element of like ambiguity that's definitely there. So I think it's important for us to engage in some of these discussions. Saying that, when you talk about illat riba, when you talk about the reasoning for the prohibition of something, why do we look to determine the reasoning of the prohibition of something? So let me think of an example. There's a couple examples that are very difficult and a couple examples that are probably easier. So the difficult examples is, for example, eating pig. Why is it haram? That's a pretty good answer. Huh? Does it matter? So that's the first question, right? Right. So I mean, you can argue a lot of things, right? You can argue that it's a right. I mean, there are a lot of uglier animals, you know, that we can consume, but the fact that it's dirty, or the fact that it doesn't have any, you know, jealousy over its partner, there's a lot of stuff that people come up with for that. But those reasonings, can I now take analogy of the reasoning of the impermissibility of those things and say, now, okay, well, this animal also exhibits that those behaviors, therefore it is impermissible? No, right? It doesn't work. Another example of this is, why can men not wear gold? Right? It's the same reason. Like, Allah knows. I don't know, right? There are certain things that are clear. Like, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibit the consumption of alcohol? Huh? Well, because of intoxication, right? Because an individual becomes intoxicated. But there, the illa mansusa, right? So over there, the reasoning is actually very clear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't drink it because you will become intoxicated. And what is intoxication? Intoxication is the inability to make sound decisions, right? It's the inability to make sound decisions. Versus, are there things that affect our decision making? Right? Like what? Right, happiness, lack of sleep, right? So can now somebody be like, no, it is haram for you to not sleep enough because your decisions are going to be skewed? Caffeine, right? Caffeine has an effect on an individual, right? It'll skew their decision-making process, but it doesn't completely cloud their judgment. But now that I have a reasoning that is clear, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually stated it, can I use that reasoning as analogy for other things? Yeah, like what? What? I'm sorry. I did. Weed. Oh, astaghfirullah. It's like, don't you know we're in DC, sister? So anyway, is the reasoning for that, like, because do I have a clear text now that tells me that marijuana is impermissible? No, there's no text, right? This is not something that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about. It's not something the companions came and encountered or dealt with. But I do have a very clear reasoning. And once I have a clear reasoning, what can I do? Right. I can use that as analogy to make other things impermissible as well. Saying that, when we go to the haram scale, right? Because there are things that are more haram and less haram. Like, so for example, lying to a store owner so I can take a lollipop, versus lying and then somebody ends up getting killed. Which one's worse? I mean, the lollipop. No, I'm saying the right, right? Life, for sure. So, and the reason I mentioned that is that even in bayn al-muharramat, right? Even in the things that are impermissible, you have a spectrum, right? There's going to be a spectrum within them. And in this thing, what was the point I was making? Oh, about the alcohol. So over here, if I compared alcohol to marijuana, which one is more haram? Alcohol. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has named it, like, specifically, right? So when there's a specific naming for something, that is going to be the highest level of haram, and marijuana would be less than that. Not to say that it is not, that it's halal. It's still haram, but not to the same level. So now this situation of riba comes around. If I don't have clear verses that say why riba is haram, but I have very clear understandings of why it is. And what are those understandings, or what are those reasonings? No, that's how to apply riba. But I'm saying, why is riba? Okay, sure. So we know it has something to do with society, but what? What is it about riba that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has gone to the extent of saying that the one who consumes riba, Allah and His Messenger are they're waging war with them, right? So it's not just a major sin; it's a huge sin, right? This is a huge sin. So what is so huge about it? What is it that is so problematic that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has aligned Himself and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam so strongly against it? There's a very clear dividing line. Like you are on one side of the battle line, or you're on the other side.
Makes people less charitable.
Maybe, huh? It's because it exploits people, right? It takes advantage of them. There is clear dhulm, right? There's clear oppression that happens in the ribawi system. Meaning, and it's something that many people experience today. So, for example, if a person doesn't make smart financial decisions, what happens to that person? They get caught up in debt, right? They get caught up in debt, and there's a problem with the type of debt they get caught up with. What happens? Right? It keeps compounding, right? Because it's not regular interest that's happening with these debts. It's compound interest, meaning that that same money is going to continuously be added up and taxed to what is owed. So it'll be 1,000, then it'll be 1,030, and then I'll be taxed on 1,030, right? Right. That penalty is not going to be removed, and It's just going to keep what we call compounding. And the person who is now in that situation, what happens? Right, it's difficult for him to get out of, and it's a type of ownership that the creditor has over the debtor. But during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, how did it look? Right, this is a modern manifestation of this. And even with that, let's say that a person made poor financial decisions, he's bought all these things, and now he's in all this kind of credit card debt. What options does he have in the modern system? Bankruptcy. And what happens in bankruptcy? Right? It wipes everything out except student loans, right? So, right. So, right, that's another issue. But it basically clears your thing. So, showing us that. So, if a person came and they tried to argue, and they're like, okay, well, where's the oppression here? If there's a safety net there that a person can easily remove himself from that system. That's fine, but ruining your credit means that you cannot do what now? You can't borrow again. Let's go back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ and during the Asr al-Jahili. How was it exploitative, and how was it then? Do you think that they had a credit system and they'd be like, oh, no more borrowing for you? Huh? Is that how it worked?
You put on the shop, right? We sold.
People were put into actual slavery. What else happened? They would lose limbs. What else? Which is not very different to what is a modern manifestation of that? Well, no. The modern manifestation of this is like you guys know about like taking loans from like mob bosses, right? What happens? They'll break bones, right? You might be killed. But you guys had a bad experience with a mob boss? No, it actually happens, but who does it happen to, right? This is something that needs to be investigated and something that we can definitely talk about. But why would I, like why would I as an individual, is it good business sense for me to be like, okay, hey, listen, let me borrow $1,000 and I'll pay you back $3,000? Does that make sense? Why would a person be willing to do that?
Either drugs.
Okay, so either they're doing something evil, right, and they want to fulfill that, but that's more like shahwani, right? But I'm talking about in general. Desperation. So who does this system actually take advantage of? Right, the people who are desperate, the people who are poor and desperate. Which is why throughout the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about riba, from which vantage is He discussing it? The one who's consuming it, or the one who's taking it? Huh? The one who's actually taking it. Why? Because he's exploiting the other person. The other person, he's not in it most of the time, right? Most of the time, he's not doing it by what? By choice. He doesn't have money. And because he's in that exploited, it's like it's taking advantage of someone who is already vulnerable. Does that make sense? And that falls very much in line with some of the other discussions that we've had. Why is it not permissible? Like, the mal yatim, we said that taking people's money is haram, but why is it that the orphan, it's like extra haram? He just doesn't want to protect him. Like, he's vulnerable, right? Again, that issue of vulnerability. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the people who take riba, they are exploiting a vulnerable population, right? That population has nothing, like they're in a situation, they don't have any choice. So even when people go to mob bosses, why do they go to the mob boss? Because they don't have a choice. Otherwise, they would just go to Bank of America, or they would go to Citibank, or they would go to another third-party vendor, like creditor, to get that money. So when those people who are kind of forced into those spaces, they have no choice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making it so, because these people now, like they're masakin, right? They're really miskin, and nobody can stand up for them. Now, are there people who engage in riba voluntarily? Yes, there are. Like, and those people are people who are just completely and totally following their shahwa. It's like, I want that TV. Okay, yeah, we're going to put it's going to be like 30%. I don't care. I want the TV, right? So what happened? He's just putting his shahwa in front. He doesn't care how it's coming into his home. He's willing to overstep and do all the things, which is why you don't have so much of a focus on that in the Quran. And there is a little bit of focus in it in the Sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But this is why there's so much focus on akil riba, right? The people who consume it, the people who take it, because it's so exploitative. Sometimes people say like, oh, well, it allows the rich to get richer. And we say that the rich getting richer, is that concept problematic in and of itself? No, right? If they do it at the expense of others, right? Even as Muslims, even as individuals, we will pursue our self-interests. Like, is there anyone here who's going to say, no, I don't want Jannah for me, I want Jannah for this guy? Right? Like, we all want Jannah for ourselves. Like, we all want paradise for ourselves. No, I'm sorry. They're the most selfish? Allahu Akbar. That's what. And the thing is, so there's a difference between being selfish, right?
I mean, in a good time.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying, but it's just a matter, it's like, sometimes it's just a matter of wording, right?
Yeah.
So when we say like, we pursue our self-interests, that is a very Islamic concept. What is that line? What is the limit? At what point do I stop pursuing that self-interest? When it infringes on others. That's it. Right? I'm allowed to continue selling, I'm allowed to continue buying, I'm allowed to continue spending, as long as I am not taking advantage of others. Very simply. And that's how we as Muslims, that's how our moral compass works. And this is how our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and that we seek those things. So now that we have this idea, and we have this conceptually, this concept of riba, what has happened is that some scholars now have taken this illat riba, right? They've taken the reasoning for its prohibition, and they're saying it is okay to make analogy. Meaning that if you are in a system that removes that oppression, it is what? It is permissible to engage in. The problem is, like, you're taking a lot of theoretical steps, yes, and you're making a lot of assumptions.
How would you name a system that
Yeah. I'm sorry?
What kind of system would not be?
Sure, that's a good question, right? Basically, how it happened, like for me, as if I wanted to open a business, one of the things I need is capital, right? And an idea is definitely part of it, and that's something that's really important. But I need to have capital for that. So what can I do in a non-ribawi system to acquire capital to help me open a business? Something that a lot of people don't want to do, which is why they'll go and seek a loan. That'll only get me so far, right? Partnerships. So what I'm going to do is, like, maybe my first business will be 5% and 95%, yes? And after it grows a little bit, either I can start buying back shares from my partner, or what can I do? I can open a new business. And with that business, I have more capital. So what can I do? Instead of being a 5% owner, I am now a 30% owner. And what happens is, how do I get to 100%? Because now I have all of these successful models as a portfolio that I can show to investors to help in my business. But just starting off with zero, there's no, or I can get a qard hasana, right? And in Islam, what is the purpose of a loan? Charity, that's it. It's the only purpose of a loan is to empower. Meaning that if a person gives a loan to someone, in the back of his mind, what does he remember and what does he think? That I'm probably not going to get this money back. And that's fine, right? I think that's a good mentality to have. I remember one of my friends, he was in jail and he needed bail money and he's like, yo, I got you. And I was like, you do not got me. I was like, I know for sure you do not got me, but it's okay. You know what I mean? And alhamdulillah, he's out, and walillah alhamd. You know, may Allah bless him. But he didn't end up back, so that's good. I'm happy about that. So you know, there are individuals and there are people like that but are there people who will actually take that loan? They might come back like 5-10 years later, but what are they going to do? They're going to be like, hey, listen, I remember when you gave me that money. I just wanted to give it back. And that happens too. Yes.
Does it mean it's like wrong to give loans expecting something? Like, should you only give loans if you're okay being like, I don't ever want to see this money again, I have no idea?
You should be okay with that, yes. Like that is the mindset you should go into, that hey, there's a good possibility that I'm not going to see this money again. And if you want to secure your loan, you have to start setting out boundaries and make a partnership with them. In the US, it's very easy. Like you can just open up an LLC and you can start talking about like, you know, what percentages people have in their different businesses. And I think that's actually a very reasonable way forward for anyone who does want to like kind of open up a business or involve themselves, because you can actually sit down and define percentages of who owns what in each of those particular companies. But yeah, these are the two ways to actually build up the community. And these are two ways to actually build wealth in the community is through partnerships. In partnerships, there are two types, right? You have silent partners and you have active partners. The silent partners, the only thing that's expected from them is their money. But they're also expecting, they're expecting a return. Right? That's part of the reason that they're investing with you. Have you guys ever seen like Shark Tank or familiar with it? I think that's a really reasonable model. You know, maybe setting up something like that in masajid where people come and they present their business ideas and you allow people opportunity to, yes?
But why would you call it a loan if you don't? Like, why not just tell them you're giving them this?
Because that's the third option. You can just gift it. You can either gift it or you can say it's sadaqah. Because loan, in the back of your mind, like your mindset is that I'm not going to get it back, right? But in actuality, he still owes that to you.
So it's more for the receiver's mind.
Exactly. So because the one who's the debtor, the one who's taking the loan, it's a way for him to kind of keep himself in check, to make sure that, hey, no, this money isn't really mine. I need to get it back to the person I'm borrowing it from. Make sense? Because you can gift, but the thing with a gift is, and some of us might know people like this, when you gift them the money, it's more enabling than it is empowering, versus if you put the condition on it saying that, hey, this is a loan, it kind of keeps that, like it might give them that sense of accountability, and that they have to return that money back at some point.
Follow-up question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get a regular fee.
Sure. Yeah. Of course. So what I always found interesting about that verse is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us to write down our contracts, but we don't have any clear ayah or any clear hadith about writing down the Quran or the Sunnah. There's no clear command from the Kitab wala Sunnah bi kitabat al-Quran wa kitabat al-Sunnah. And we're kind of back. I'm sorry? Yeah. Like I feel that's a huge reflection of its importance. I was just talking to a brother yesterday, and he was like, yeah, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that, like, for irshad, like, to get like just general guidance that people should do that. And I'm like, yeah, I agree, but I think it's important. So the problem now with this idea of riba is saying, okay, well, if this is the reasoning, and if you remove the reasoning, there's a lot of speculation, right? There's a lot of speculation that's involved in that, because you cannot 100% for surety say that this is the specific reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited it. Which is why you have such a spectrum of opinions about how to deal with riba, ribawi transactions, what constitutes a ribawi transaction, on what can riba apply, what does it not apply on. I think there's a lot of healthy discussion around this issue, but I think the unhealthy portion of it is kind of limiting it and just saying, oh, it's interest, right? And I don't think that's doing the subject justice. And I think there's a lot more exploration that definitely needs to happen. I think usury applies 100%. I think that's actually a very reasonable thing. But interest in and of itself, I think there are ribawi parts to it, but I also think that there are permissible parts to it that need to be explored. And even how it applies, to fiat is not something that existed during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Inflation, where things change in value, I think that definitely applies, but not to the extent and not by design. I think things will always fluctuate in what they're worth, but I don't think there's a natural progression of inflation in commodity the same way that there is in fiat. I mean, just look at what's happening in the world today. You know what I mean? Pakistan, Egypt, Lebanon, even Turkey. It's just like things are just spiraling out of control. It's Allah protect us. And in one of the conversations I usually have with people is like, okay, well, you think that the same kind of ribawi rules apply. I have two issues with this. I say, number one, how do you calculate zakat? Off of gold, right? You use gold to calculate zakat. And why? If fiat has inherent value in and of itself, why would you base it off of gold, right? Wouldn't you just kind of set a standard and be like, and fix it at that? So that shows that there's, how you accept it or whatnot, you say, okay, no, there's a prophetic, clear thing. Okay, tayyib, no problem. But you still acknowledge the fluctuation that's here and that exists. And also, like, how many people lose the entire savings because of inflationary currency? I remember I married overseas, and when I gave my wife's mahar it was like $1,000 then in the currency, and now if I give her like that same currency, like $250 or something like that. It's ridiculous. Like, it's ridiculous on how much is lost in these exchanges and the value of this wealth. Allah protect us. I think working within the paradigm of the dollar, we're kind of privileged, because we don't really feel the effects. Well, maybe in the last year, but like other than that, we haven't like super really felt the effects of that inflation. But after that, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, وَتَوَلَّى يَوْمَ الزُّحْفِ. So he says over here that turning your back when the army advances. Why? Now remember we were talking about selfishness?
Yes.
What have you done?
Put your life over everyone else.
You've put your life in front of everyone else's. After what? After making the commitment, right? After making that commitment, you've turned against everyone. And not just the other problem with this is like one of the biggest motivators in that position. Like when you have the two armies are lined up, one of the biggest things that happen during that time is morale, right? Like, and having morale many times will shift the tide of battle. So the moment I run away, what happens? Right? You can start creating a chain reaction where people actually lose that morale. And at least relatively early in Islam, like up until Yawm al-Fath, did they ever have like a numbers advantage? No. Right? There's never like a numerical advantage in those fights. Like many times it was like 10 to 1, right? 10 to 1, 5 to 1, 2 to 1. Like even 2 to 1 would probably be like the least. But and they were like many times ill-equipped. Allah musta'an. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still gave them victory. The last one I find interesting, and I think this is something that is the Prophet ﷺ talking about accusing chaste women. He doesn't say accusing men, right? He says accusing chaste women. Why?
Was it a common thing back then to accuse women?
Well, it's not uncommon anymore, right? It still happens. And why is it done? So this is the last. What is the list? Shirk, magic, murder, eating the wealth of the orphan, consuming riba, turning away from the battlefield, and this last one, accusing chaste women.
It's also exploitative in a way.
It is, right? So when we talk about vulnerable populations, from that population, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in Surah An-Nisa, what kind of people does He talk about throughout the entire surah? Because it's not just women. He talks about vulnerable and weak populations. And here, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if you look, all of these things are taking advantage of others. And in this situation, who's being taken advantage of? The chaste women. But again, why is that the case? Why women? How come the same standard doesn't apply to men?
I don't know, but in societal value, there's a value of
Virginity, yeah.
virginity, yes.
Mhm.
There's that value that
Sure.
you want from somebody.
Okay. Why is that? Why does that exist? And we're not here to talk about what is wrong, what is right, right? There are certain norms that exist.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why does that norm exist?
Because of the pride. So,
You know what I'm saying? So, for a man who is unchaste, it's looked down on. But it's not looked down to the same extent.
Right. Like the guy who's a player, the woman who's a whore.
Sure. Why? Like, why is that? Khalas, I want you guys to think about that. We'll come back after Salah, inshallah. I hope I don't distract your Salah too much. Huh? We're going to come back after Maghrib, inshallah.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة
أنا أقول تحية المسجد ليس الصلاة مستقلة، بس هي عبارة عن ركعتين. فلو صليتي 4 ركعات الظهر تكفي، لأن ليش؟ 4 ركعات منها ركعتين. النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أمر يعني بركوع ركعتين، لكن ما قيد بصلاة معينة. يعني يعني مثلا لو جيتي وصليتي وتر، جيتي بعد العشاء وصليتي ركعة واحدة تكفي؟ لا بس هذا هو. So if you pray any salah, ظهر عصر مغرب عشاء whatever one, that's okay. You don't need to make تحية المسجد.
اوكي انا كنت بقرا
لا